Rangelands are the common good of all of us Westerners and probably Earthlings, because rangelands are the woodlands, grasslands, shrublands, and deserts that dominate the Earth's land surface.
Produce food, the fiber, the water in the form of clear running streams and rivers, the ecosystem services that make civilization possible.
Your deer are there, your elk are there, your fish are there, and people love and enjoy to go and see those places. It's really all interconnected.
We face problems with wildfires, invasive species, with open space.
Incredibly important to keep large tracts of land functioning and in open space, and ranches currently are serving that function.
We have to operate sustainably, and if we don't operate sustainably, we're gone.
And all the values that society asks: open space, clean air, clean water, abundant fish and wildlife populations, space to recreate.
Really important that the rest of the country doesn't lose touch with the land.
The mentality that everyone owns it, so everyone needs to be responsible with it and leave a legacy of good stewardship.
It's a place, it's a feeling, sometimes it's just a state of mind. It may not be what you were looking for, but it's here in what you find. And it's all these things, it's the West.
The Western Rangelands, vast open spaces spanning half a continent, legacy of a young nation's epic journey toward its destiny. For the early settlers, these were lands of hope and opportunity, just as they are for present and future generations. The rangelands cover nearly half the American West. More than half of these are privately owned, and of the rest, 43%, 300 million acres, are public lands. They are divided by countless borders of ownership and boundaries of jurisdiction, and yet the rangelands are wholly interdependent.
Rangelands are our common good, and everybody has a stake in the resources that come off of rangelands and the ecological forces and resources that come from rangelands, like clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, forage for livestock, wildlife habitat. All of those are our common good, so we should all, in essence, care about rangelands.
But the future of the Western rangelands is uncertain. The delicate balance of these ecosystems is being threatened by population growth and development, and by the interrelated effects of climate change, invasive species, and wildfires. Today, many scientists, natural resource managers, and private landowners are working to develop strategies to restore the health of these lands and ensure their sustainability for the future. Many believe one answer may be found in the evolutionary history of the Western rangelands.
We can look at the diaries of Lewis and Clark expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition came through North Dakota in 1804, 5, and 6, before any settlement and any grazing or fencing of the prairies. They constantly were talking about the number of bison, the number of elk, number of deer and pronghorn antelope, and all the predators that came with them. Periodic fires, wildfires, came across the prairies. We also had things like drought, natural, floods, natural. All of these disturbances created these prairies. But probably the greatest was the grazing animal.
With the Homestead Acts of more than a century ago, the federal government encouraged settlement of the Western Territories, offering settlers title to small parcels of land on the condition that the land would be occupied and improved. These parcels were generally too small and the forage too limited to support ranching operations without the use of adjacent public lands, where grazing was unregulated. With the promise of land and sufficient forage for livestock grazing, the Western Rangelands invited settlement, the birth of communities, and a way of life sustained by the land that endures today. As the frontier advanced, however, grazing practices from areas of higher rainfall in the east were not suited to the arid and semi-arid landscapes of Western Rangelands. Livestock grazing took a toll on the land.
There wasn't any incentive for anybody not to graze all of the grass that was there, because if they didn't graze it, somebody would come along behind them and graze it. And so there was no vegetation in a lot of those areas. There isn't any question the rangelands are in a tremendously better shape than they have been in this century.
Since that period, 150 years ago, we've come a long way. We've learned a lot about how individual plants grow, plant autoecology that's called. We've learned a lot about plant synecology, how plant communities interact with one another in the face of disturbances like fire and grazing. The knowledge that we've gained, I think, has allowed rangeland managers to graze in a more sustainable way.
As the science of range management has evolved, so too has federal policy for managing public lands. The rangelands were open to unregulated grazing until 1934, when the Taylor Grazing Act led to better control of livestock grazing, with fencing of some grazing areas, protection of riparian areas through strategic placement of water sources, seasonal adjustments in grazing, and reductions in livestock numbers. Over the last half-century, livestock grazing on public lands has declined by nearly 50%. Many agencies manage public rangelands, but much of the responsibility rests with the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Land Management, with stewardship of approximately 2/3 of all public rangelands. Today, public rangelands are governed by a variety of laws, including the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. This law requires that public lands be managed for multiple use, supporting many different activities, resources, and uses. Changes in grazing management continue to be made to improve the overall health of the rangelands, and in some cases to ensure balanced management of the public lands for multiple use, including public recreation and the protection of threatened or endangered species.
There's this happy medium there with moderate livestock grazing, and that level of grazing pressure actually favors an abundance of wildlife species as well as plant life, enhances biological diversity when it's properly managed moderate livestock grazing.
With more than half the Western Rangelands privately owned, ranchers play a critical role in preserving many values that are important to us all.
These folks are going to help maintain our open landscapes. They're going to help maintain the type of wildlife and fisheries and recreational opportunities that folks want. And it's very important for them that people understand that they're not out here to ruin or harm the land. They want to work in harmony with the land.
Working in harmony with the land may mean practices such as seasonal adjustments, rotational grazing, changes in numbers and distribution of livestock. These modern grazing practices are making a difference, documented in the dramatic changes occurring in places like Shoshone Creek in southern Idaho, Muddy Creek in south-central Wyoming, Indian Jack Creek in west-central Nevada, and in cooperative conservation efforts across the West. Working in harmony with the land, many ranchers are using another tool, targeted grazing, to accomplish specific conservation objectives. Among these is controlling invasive species, considered the single greatest threat to the ecology of the Western Rangelands. To observe this conservation tool at work, we join one of the pioneers of targeted grazing.
We sit right here on what they call the Little Snowy Mountains, and behind us are the Big Snowy Mountains.
I'm here today with Pablo Campos, the herder in the band of sheep that we've been grazing on some leafy spurge in this area right now. And they prefer over grasslands small forbs, which they really like, and weeds walk right into that category so well.
5 generations of the family have been ranching here. Over the past 20 years, John Lefelt has been refining the practice of targeted grazing.
It's an integrated part between us as managers and the herders and the guardian dogs for protection from predators. There's an old saying that you keep a group of sheep around to keep the weeds down, and we stopped doing that. And of course, when we, as we started to ignore the weed situation, it just ballooned into a situation where you had to have a controlled weed eater. And basically the sheep are that weed eater or that tool.
In recent years, John Lefelt and his weed-eating bands of sheep have been working with Montana State University and the Montana Wool Growers Association to advance the science of targeted grazing. Study areas have shown a 70% reduction in weed infestation where the sheep have been deployed.
This is one way to ride it, and the sheep are, they make everybody a little stronger because they create jobs, they keep meat on the table. There's food fiber coming off this program. That'll do, Toby. Toby, that'll do.
As a tool for combating invasive species, targeted grazing has many positive benefits for the landscape and those who depend on it. Among these are the many native species of wildlife, including species of concern such as the sage grouse, whose survival depends on healthy habitat.
What most people don't recognize is that the =1 cause of the listing of endangered species in the United States are invasive species, plants and animals. So here we've got a tool with 4 legs that can come in and actually treat areas of invasive species at minimal costs and come back into habitat that can be beneficial for wildlife.
Modern grazing practices can contribute to healthier rangelands in another important way, by controlling invasive species such as cheatgrass that can provide fuels for catastrophic wildfires. Targeted grazing can result in less intense fires and faster recovery of native vegetation. Healthier rangelands are also being recognized for the role they can play in mitigating the effects of climate change. Like the tropical rainforests, healthy rangelands act as a carbon sink that absorbs atmospheric carbon dioxide, a major contributor to global climate change. For a closer look at the ecological benefits of modern grazing management, we travel to the Magic Valley of south-central Idaho. Across this landscape, a variety of pressures over many years impacted the ecological balance of the land. Over the past 20 years, federal and state land managers, local ranchers, conservation and recreation interests have been working together to heal the land.
We helped start a collaborative group called the Pioneers Alliance that is looking at protecting wildlife migration routes and working farms and ranches in the region, with the realization that both the wildlife and our own operation depend on preserving that much bigger landscape.
Their strategies rest to a large degree on innovations in livestock grazing practices. Among the innovations is the use of GPS collars to monitor the grazing practices of the sheep. This information helps the herders and ranch managers protect sensitive wildlife habitat and migration routes.
And the most obvious improvements have been along the riparian and stream corridors, with more woody species that provide cover and shade for the streams, and that helps the fish as well as the songbirds and other wildlife. There have been improvements in the sagebrush communities as well, which really is the majority of the habitat.
Successful conservation measures on the ranch have a positive influence across the landscape.
We're carrying on a centuries-old tradition here in this amazing landscape, raising animals carefully, humanely, and in harmony with nature.
I'd like to see this landscape permanently protected.
Certainly when we're gone, we'd like to see our legacy continue.
That legacy is already being realized with the ranch's donation of 7,500 acres of private land as a conservation easement.
We've got some other landowners that are interested in easements as well, and we may create a landscape here that's, you know, 1 million acres of permanent conservation. Wouldn't that be an incredible legacy?
While providing environmental services such as clean air, clean water, and the biodiversity of native plant and animal life, the Western Rangelands are also an important economic asset to local communities, the states, and the nation. The ranching way of life that brought settlement to this area, as it did much of the West, is still a mainstay of Wyoming's economy in the 21st century.
The number used there is that $1 spent in the local community turns over about 7 times. So in Wyoming, agriculture is a $1 billion industry. So if we look at that impact that it has on the entire state, it truly is phenomenal.
Public lands have always been critical to the economic viability of ranching here in the Bighorn Basin, where more than 3 million acres of public lands are open to grazing. But the West is changing. With the rapid population growth across much of the West, many private lands and open spaces are being lost to residential and commercial development. At the same time, tourism and recreation have emerged as important elements in the economics of the New West.
Tourists that come into Wyoming, you ask, well, what do you want to see? They say, we want to see a cowboy and some cattle or sheep or horses, something that's really happening out there on the ranch. The basis of it all is those ranches out there that seem to hold Wyoming together and the people on those ranches.
Many ranchers are discovering new opportunities in the tourism and recreation industry that can help them remain economically viable in the New West.
And that could include something like adding a fee-based hunting operation or, a complete dude ranch operation.
And if the ranches don't survive,
when we lose a ranch in Wyoming and that ranch goes away, it's gone forever. And that's a real economic loss. But if you look at the loss of wildlife, it's going to hurt our economy even more than just the loss of the ranch and the people in the ranching business.
It'll ripple through the whole economy, not just the ranchers, but all the support industries, the local businesses. We see that happen continually throughout the western U.S.
Here in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming, diverse stakeholders are discovering that the economics of the Old West and the New West are not exclusive, but are in fact interdependent. Groups such as the Wyoming Audubon, Trout Unlimited, Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife, the Nature Conservancy, and the livestock industry have found common ground. The Alliance is leading a public awareness campaign celebrating the place of ranching in the New West. We've considered the importance of the rangelands to the environment and to the economy. But there are other ways to measure the value of these magnificent open spaces and the Western way of life. They are often more eloquently expressed by the people of the West.
I get to celebrate my culture, the culture that I come from. That's my job. I get to go around and show people the West in all the different ways that there are the West. It may not be what you were looking for, but it's here in what you find. And it's all these things, it's the West. It can be anything you ever dreamed of, and it might be more than you bargained for. It's an image up on the silver screen. It's a ranch kid doing chores. I remember with my son one time when we were at the ranch. He was young. He wanted to saddle. And he had to do it himself, you know. So I remember coming in to see him in bed one night, and we were dead tired. We were really pooped. And I said, "Boy, you're tired, aren't you?" And he said, "Yeah, but you know, Dad, it's a good tired." I get a little sentimental when I think about these kind of things, but it's a thing that you feel, I did that. But I saw my son work hard through my direction, and he made enough money to buy his first saddle. That's the reward.
It may not be what you were looking for, but it's here in what you find. And it's all these things. It's the West.
Midway between the legendary frontier town of Tombstone and the rapidly growing metropolis of Tucson, the Sonoyta Valley is in many ways a link, perhaps a bridge, between the Old West and the New. In the Old West, the high desert and rolling grasslands of the Sonoyta Valley were valued primarily for the forage that supported cattle ranching and for the silver deposits that lured prospectors here. For the New West, they present a much richer tapestry of benefits to all of society.
I see a wide open valley full of wildlife like pronghorn. I see a thriving grassland that's healthy enough to weather droughts and still have enough grass to hold the soil when the big rains come.
In the mid-1980s, this valley seemed destined for residential and commercial development. Recognizing that priceless resources could be lost forever, the Bureau of Land Management stepped in to acquire the property through a land exchange. A pivotal issue for the agency and the many stakeholders was whether a tradition from the Old West, livestock grazing, still had a place on these rangelands.
What we hope to achieve here is mesh the Old West and the New West into the best of both of those. There's a lot of pressure on ranchers today to sell and subdivide, especially in an area that's so close to a huge metropolitan area. And so there has to be creative solutions that we come up with together to try to keep those ranches intact and keep them as open space.
We were lucky in that we had a nice mix of people that were committed and tried to look at it from an intellectual standpoint, not just emotions. And this is our life. This is what we depend upon for our living.
I think that above all that we have more in common than we generally recognize, and if we can get to our really deeply held values, we'll find that most of those really are shared values.
In 2003, after 8 years of negotiation by the BLM and the various stakeholders, the group completed a balanced management plan for this area that provides for livestock grazing, recreation, preservation of cultural and historic resources, and conservation of many environmental services. All the benefits society derives from healthy and sustainable rangelands.
I have a lot of hopes. The biggest one is that we keep this an intact, functioning ecosystem, that we continue to have the open native grasslands and the riparian areas. We maintain surface water in the creek. We continue to have a place where people can really experience natural open spaces.
The story of the Western frontier is, more than anything else, a story of hope. That spirit of hope endures today across the Western rangelands. A legacy of the frontier, livestock grazing, is finding its place in the New West. From the Sonoyta Valley of southern Arizona to the Magic Valley of Idaho, the Bighorn country of northern Wyoming, and the snowy mountains of Montana, the case studies we've examined are neither isolated nor unique. They are postcards from the new frontier, where diverse interests are working together to sustain the Western rangelands. They're helping to preserve the environmental services these lands provide: clean air, clean water, and biodiversity. They are discovering new economic opportunity for the future, and they are preserving many other values, including the historic, cultural, scenic, and recreational resources that enrich our society and the quality of life we all enjoy. The Western Rangelands can be conserved for our benefit and for the benefit of future generations, but only with the wise stewardship of all who have a stake in these treasured landscapes.
The number one issue facing public rangelands is the loss of private-based properties, that private land that could be lost through development and fragmentation. And I'm not just talking environmental loss or ecological loss, I'm talking socioeconomic losses.
I hope the general public can take a more active role in what goes on in an understanding the lifestyle, the community, the connectedness, the history, and the culture behind the livestock industry.
They need to realize that if public lands grazing goes away, it's a domino effect. There are other legitimate uses out there that could go away as easily.
We've come a long ways in how we've been able to use grazing and manage it properly so that we can actually deal with the multiple uses and desires that we have as a society.
There is still much work to be done, still many fragile areas of rangeland where ecological conditions have been degraded or where current resource management approaches are not working. But progress is being made, and there is reason to believe the future looks brighter still as the science and the art of range management continue to advance in the hands of new generations of resource managers.
What growing up on the land has really done for me is it's helped to develop my appreciation for the land and my want to work with the land in the future.
To help those rangelands look nice, to help those isolated streams look nice and keep them in good condition, there's just no better feeling.
40, 50, 100 years from now, someone might not know your name, might not know who you were, but they can say, someone here did the right thing, they managed well, and look at it now.
It may not be what you were looking for, but it's here in what you find. And it's all these things. It's the West. It's a place. It's a feeling. Sometimes it's just a state of mind. It may not be what you were looking for, but it's here in what you find. And it's all these things. It's the West. It may not be what you were looking for, but it's here in what you find. And it's all these things. It's the West.